Welcome, everybody. This is the January edition of AML Voices. I'm John Byrne with AML Right Source, and our topic this month, and everybody is obviously aware that this is Human Trafficking Awareness Month in January. Our topic this month is human trafficking in 2026. We're going to give you some both practical and some strategic advice regarding dealing with this horrific issue from a financial perspective. With me today, Doug Gilmore. He's a former federal government official, and he's now president and CEO of Resolve Strategies. Has spent much of his career dealing with the issues of human trafficking and human smuggling. Doug, we appreciate your time today. Helen Harrison is a former bank official, and now she's with us. She's an associate director of financial crimes advisory for AML Right Source, and she's located in the UK. And also, really happy to have Angel Swift. Angel is a longtime AML expert at a variety of financial institutions and fintechs. She is also now has been a board member of Polaris Project, and we're going to talk about Polaris in a bit. So, as always with these programs, we do have a Q&A box. If you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to put those in the box. We're going to, again, try to cover a number of issues from both operational issues as also some policy questions and get the take of our experts on how we can continue to battle this horrific problem. I thought we would start, I'm going to start with Doug. And I think to set the stage, I think all of us generally know what the areas of concern are. But Doug, maybe it makes sense to talk about what human trafficking is, what it's not. So set the stage, and then we can talk about some of the issues that go along with the tools needed to deal with, again, that awful problem. So Doug, give us your take on some of this. Again, you've had both private and public sector experience, so really appreciate your time today.
Yep. Thank you, John. Um, let's start with what it's not. In kind of generalities, it's not typically how it's portrayed in the media, in TVs and in TV shows, feature films. It's not the movie Taken. Um, it is not about white vans that are lurking to take you or steal your kids out of a parking lot in Walmart after putting a zip tie on your door handle. Or, I mean, there's just so many urban myths or urban legends. Um, it's not to say that some of those things don't happen or can't happen, but statistically, they're very insignificant. Um, I think the statistic is that less than 0.5% of the people who are kidnapped actually end up being trafficked. So statistically, it's an insignificant number. Doesn't mean people aren't kidnapped. It's just that typically when that happens, the perpetrator has an ulterior motive, shall we say. Um, Trafficking is not about transportation. It's not human smuggling. It's not people crossing the border. While there can be an international nexus, while there can be some overlap between smuggling and trafficking, they are two very distinct crimes. Human smuggling is a crime against the border. It is the unlawful movement of people who, by choice, pay to be moved across an international border for the sole purpose of evading law enforcement. That's what human smuggling is. Human trafficking is a crime of exploitation. It's a crime against a person. Human trafficking involves force or the threat of force, fraud, or coercion to compel another person into committing commercial sex acts or some type of labor or services. So, sex trafficking, labor trafficking. If you are a minor, so someone under the age of 18, in under federal statute, some states the age is higher. We don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion if you're a minor. The the law is pretty clear that if you are a minor, you cannot consent to a commercial sex act. So we no longer use terms like child prostitution. We no longer charge kids, minors, with prostitution because we recognize that they cannot consent to to commercial sex acts.
Helen, you had a background in the financial sector, as has Angel. And one of the things that we talked about as we prepared for this is the variety of financial scams that occur that in many cases can be used to force individuals into trafficked situation. And I know Doug has mentioned that as well. Talk a little bit about that, and then obviously want to get some additional thoughts from Angel and Doug. Talk about some of those scams because that's part of the challenge, right? The challenge of our industry for the AML community to figure out what are some of the things we should be looking for because scams can affect people on the outside that aren't trafficked, but they also can be done specifically to attack and harm trafficked persons. So talk a bit about that.
I think the way I'd probably describe this is hiding in plain sight. I think from what I've seen in my experience working in different financial institutions is that people might look fine, but they might not be. And that could be because, they're working in different industries. It could be that they're working in farming industry. It could be that they're working in some kind of agriculture. They might be working in a nail bar or a car wash, construction site, whatever it might be. And, you know, I've noticed, and I'm sure others will, if you stop and think about it for a minute, that you might notice that these individuals aren't necessarily from the local area. They might not even speak the local language. And they might be extremely quiet or extremely distant or completely disengaged. We might not know looking at that, going through a car wash or whatever it might be, but these people are probably living in really chronic conditions and being forced to work under really difficult terms. Um, you know, Majority of these individuals have probably had their ID taken away from them and they have to work because they don't have any other option. They have no freedom and there is no way for them to get out of the situation that they've found themselves in. A couple of examples that I have been privy to. There is a number of rural roads in the United Kingdom, often used as alternative routes when the traffic is really bad on a really busy motorway. Looks completely normal on the face of it. On the side there'll be lay-bys where people can pull in just to have a bit of a break, a bit of a stop or whatever they need to do. And you'll see trucks stopping or cars stopping or someone maybe stopping to get a sandwich or whatever it might be. Looks completely normal on the face of it. The reality is, on some of these roads, you might see trucks stopping and drivers getting out of these trucks or cars stopping and drivers getting out of the cars, disappearing, and then coming back, say 20 minutes or so later. This is a regular occurrence. It might go on, overnight, all day, or whatever. And you think to yourself, well, what's happening there? That's really strange. And basically, what's happening is sexual exploitation. There is someone being placed there. People are being forced to perform acts or, again, face the consequences. Again, probably not having any identification, so they can't leave and they're being forced. And if they're not doing what they're being told to do, they'll probably get beaten. And to the normal person probably driving up that road, you wouldn't suspect a single thing, like I hadn't until I actually saw some photographs of what was going on. And I think, the signs to look for when if you come across anything like this is like the physical appearance of people. How are they behaving? What are the conditions that they might be working in? Are there any signs, people being shouted at or people, behaving in a different way? And you might not see anything like that. And then again, you might. This is why it's kind of hiding in plain sight because you don't really know. You can't really see it.
So that's useful for society in general, right? To be paying attention to what's going on around you. if we spend some of our time focusing that, that's good. Create that awareness so that, there are signs and posters and telling people to pay attention and to report what they see. But from a financial perspective, Angel, and obviously from your role at the board on Polaris, but also your involvement with financial institutions for what are some of the additional things? Helen mentioned obviously paying attention to what's going on around you, but from an analyst perspective in an institution, what are some of the key red flags, alerts? And then I'm curious of Doug's perspective from his time in the government. What are some of the things that, besides being aware, analysts should be prepared to look for internally at their institutions?
Sure. And I think a lot of the things that Helen mentioned provide also amazing context. Because if you think back to all of the work that's been done around bringing awareness to human trafficking and what are all the different topologies, and you're going to hear me talk about Polaris a lot because I think Polaris has partnered with a lot of really fantastic organizations, financial institutions, law enforcement, technology companies, other nonprofits across multiple industries. I think it's really important to keep that context in mind because in a financial institution, from an analyst or a monitoring perspective, or even a KYC perspective, we're so focused on what is the data that we're given, and does the data that we're given make sense in our own little bubble? And so all of the context that we're hearing and learning about on a regular basis helps to then inform and crystallize, kind of what that picture is. So, opening up a bank account and somebody coming in with another person and looking kind of, scared or meek, right? Like those are, even though they're real world observations, they also facilitate the ability to identify whether or not there could be potential red flags happening within a financial institution as well. And especially now, as Doug was talking earlier too, and defining, kind of the forced labor trafficking component. And I think about what we're seeing now more and more in financial institutions. And as we think about that, is that a lot of the human trafficking that's occurring today, I think human traffickers have figured out everything can be done online. We can force people to commit online crimes. And that's either through, commercial sex exploitation, right? Child, sex exploitation content, through coercion by, threatening to release terrible photos of people and their children online. And then the use of cryptocurrency only has helped, kind of push a lot of the activity that we're seeing, a little bit more into the anonymity realm. But as you mentioned, John, right, the whole point of, I think, financial institutions really getting involved, and I cannot stress enough the uber importance that every single person, from an onboarding person, a KYC person, all the way through, transaction monitoring, filing SARs, board members, understanding what human trafficking looks like, is because the financial industry touches every single industry and every single part of human trafficking. So we can tell the story and identify potential indicators and potential red flags by understanding what the topologies look like. So I know you asked me, what are they? What are the red flags? And there are quite a few, and they're going to sound very similar to things that we continue to hear about over and over again. And it's because what I always say as I'm talking about transaction monitoring is that the topologies don't change over time, but the way they look in our financial records do, right? So for example, at onboarding, when a customer is establishing an account and visiting a branch to conduct transactions, are they escorted by a third party? That looks differently in the digital era, right? In the digital era, when you can open up a bank almost completely online, now we're looking at, does the ID that's being used by a person who's opening a bank look fake? Or have there been certain data elements, for example, an email address or a physical address or a company? Is that being used over and over and over again in order to open multiple accounts? So even the onboarding process, so as we're thinking about a customer establishing a relationship with a bank, how are they establishing it? And are there other kind of connection points to other accounts associated with that customer? Cash deposits, obviously, really something that continues to be something that triggers review and requires investigation. And I think kind of the use of and the ability to track how and when virtual currency is being converted is also, and the rate at which it's being converted and locations at which it's being converted is also something that continues to come up over again. Payments to employment or student recruitment agencies that are not licensed or registered or have labor violations. And I think for a long time, people have been trying to bring, and especially Polaris has been trying to bring awareness to labor trafficking. And as we're hearing that, we're going to see, and I know Doug and Helen probably both have examples of this, of how that topology of coercion and debt bondage and force to require people to sit and commit identity theft, fraud, et cetera, is becoming more and more of a scheme. So those data point and connection points are really important. Frequent payments to online escort services. We all obviously know kind of the kind of high risk industry. Helen mentioned some nail salons, massage parlors, right? Some of those have also, I mean, I live in New York City and I'm walking around Midtown and all of a sudden there are ATM machines popping up, not ATM machines, current cryptocurrency, right? ATM machines popping up in front of the souvenir stores. And I'm seeing that consistently. They're always in front of souvenir stores. So where we see those types of commonalities, really, really important. Understanding who the consumer, customer, your member is and what they're using the account for, really important to determine whether or not activity is commensurate. I know that's a old tried and true topology, but it's tried and true for a reason. Oftentimes, especially when we're thinking about hiding in plain sight as a shell company, we're seeing a lot of inconsistencies around the types of transactions. I can keep going on a lot of the factors. I think some of them probably will be brought up in some of the further case studies, and we can kind of recap those. But a lot of, I think those are like a lot of the key basic ones that could signal human trafficking and other potential financial crimes, but certainly with the context and understanding of kind of what human trafficking looks like today, really help shape and crystallize whether or not I should be looking into John Burns' account immediately.
Yeah, Doug, you made the point that about what it is and what it's not. I think what some people fail to appreciate about when we talk about human trafficking, it's not always the sexual exploitation. It's, as you both said, labor trafficking. We did a webinar late last year or maybe earlier last year where it was about relationship fraud. And one of the lead panelists was a victim. She's now a victim's advocate, but she talked about getting into a relationship with somebody online who she'd never met, ended up giving this person so much money, it was unreal. And it turned out that this person had been, I would say kidnapped, but basically forced to go to one of these scam centers, lack of a better term, and to get this money from this individual, and this person had no choice because they were going to harm their families and that sort of thing. What are some similar case studies like that that are adjacent to what we think of as human trafficking, but as you both have said, it's much broader, sadly, much broader than the sexual exploitation. It's the exploitation financially of individuals who sometimes, many times, have no options because of what either the cartel or the organized organization is forcing them to do. Talk a bit about that and how financial institutions can look for, as Angel points out, some additional indicators that could mean, hey, let's file a SAR, let's call law enforcement, let's do some investigation, because you've had that experience on both sides.
Yeah. So I think, to kind of further set the stage to what we're talking about, make no mistake, human trafficking, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, is a financially motivated crime. At the end of the day, that's the people that may purchase sex. They may be purchasing sex for sexual gratification. But for the trafficker, for the people that are behind, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, it's all about making money at the end of the day. for years, the common statistic was that it's a $150 billion a year industry. We used that number for like 12 years. It was never updated. The actual number is about almost $347 billion a year based on the 2024 NASDAQ financial crimes report. That number is actually higher than the number reported by the ILO, the International Labor Organization. But looking at the way that the ILO collected data related to sex and labor trafficking compared to the way that NASDAQ did, I have much more confidence in NASDAQ's numbers than I do in ILO's numbers. And that could be a conversation for another day. But it's a huge number. Labor trafficking is a bigger issue than sex trafficking. There are more labor trafficking victims in the United States and around the world than there are sex trafficking victims. Sex trafficking gets a lot of the attention because it's sensational. It's got the word sex in it. It gets the attention in the media. But labor trafficking is equally horrific, and it's difficult for us to identify a lot of times. Actually, most of us probably see it every day. We just don't recognize it for what it is because it looks just like people going to work, right? To Helen's point, and even to Angel's point, if somebody comes into a financial institution to open an account, but somebody else is holding their documents, at least here in the United States, holding their immigration documents, that's a crime. It's a misdemeanor crime, but interestingly enough, it's the only federal misdemeanor that is a specified unlawful activity for money laundering. So there's a lot of nexus there. I think as far as the scam centers go, we're seeing more and more, particularly Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, where I know of one scam center right now where I believe there are victims from about 70 different nations that have been defrauded, believing that they were going there to do one thing, that are now stuck there helping to perpetrate these scams. They're labor trafficking victims. We may not see them, but they're being forced to facilitate these scams. A lot of them are romance scams. They could be other types of illicit scams. They prey just like anybody else, any other person involved in trafficking. They're going to prey on a person with a vulnerability. That could be an elderly person who's lonely, that's seeking a relationship. It could be someone that obviously, through their social media, that kind of thing, has financial means, that may be susceptible, to some kind of fraud or an investment scam. And I think we need to do a better job today. And some are there are some real champions in this work that are taking a very keen interest, in these types of scams, and they're noticing people coming in or, wanting to continuously wire large sums of money, or they're wanting to take money out of their account to put it in crypto. And a lot of times it's really about asking some basic questions, and then also not being afraid to say no. You can't do that. You can't transfer $20,000 a day. We're going to cut you off and say, $500 is your limit until you demonstrate to us what's actually going on. And I know that can be a risky business proposition for financial institutions, but at the end of the day, we also have to protect the consumer.
And the scam is kind of on both sides too, right, Doug? Like, I feel like there's been a lot of evolution of recruitment right, of
Mhm.
how people, and there could be also victims recruiting, right? So that I think
Right.
is also kind of like this vicious cycle of the exploitation piece, right? Because that word exploitation, and maybe we should be using it more even than trafficking, is really kind of, I think, the key to how we're seeing a lot of these kind of same cycles continue on and on and on. And how do we stop that kind of mind kind of exploitation? But there's a lot of coercion that's happening as people are being recruited, going to these centers, as you talked about, as well as, you know, people who are committing the scams themselves, whether or not they're the romance scams or financial exploitations. I think we're seeing I know that I get nonstop text messages, LinkedIn messages of, you know, what I believe to be very AI generated
Mhm.
kind of advertisements or communications. And it's just as easy to just click, you know, no, report or whatever it is these days, as, you know, instead of saying no, it's even easier. We just hit no. But what I'm hoping is on the other side of that, there's a whole ton of data that's being collected by someone that could potentially connect and identify where some of these hubs are. I think there was an Interpol report that came out in 2025 where, as you mentioned, a lot of the hubs were starting off. I think there was like a warning back in the early 2020s, I guess, where a lot of the hubs were occurring in Southeast Asia. And I think there's a trend that's happening more and more so now in 2025, 2026, that it's expanding out to all parts of the country. And as you say, 70 different countries, all going to people from 70 different countries, all being really coerced to come to one area with the promise of making more money, a better life, and so on and so forth.
Hey, Helen, with your background at financial institutions and now advising them as uh, clients for RightSource, what are some of the challenges, both from a training perspective, because there's obviously so many crimes and risk governance and risk issues that have to be navigated, but also you want, because I think institutions want to be proactive in this space, but there's so many, like I say, competing challenges. How do you make the case internally, that this needs to be a priority, number one? And secondly, what's the best mode that you've seen of training in this space? Again, you've talked very well about the hiding in plain sight, so making people more aware, but from a compliance, financial crime prevention standpoint, what are some of the things that you could advise our audience about? Hey, when you're trying to set up a program, here's some points you should make, and here's the value proposition of being proactive in this space, besides the obvious, because it's the right thing to do.
I think, from my experience, it depends on where you work and what appetite, the risk appetite is in the business that you work in, right? So what is the group MLRO looking for, and what what threats are at what level in that institution? I think I'll talk about something that I did. So when I was at in my previous role, I set up a team that used data analytics to try and proactively identify threat. And one of the threats that we looked at was what we call MSHT, which is modern slavery, human trafficking, all encompassing. And what I tried to do is use raw data. So rather than trying to use automation, I tried to use raw data and overlay that with behavioral indicators. So the same thing that Angel's talked about and what Doug's talked about. What does this actually look like? So when you're seeing this going through transactions, what are the key patterns, the key behaviors that you should be looking for? And with that, score these on a kind of like a risk scoring basis, so that you can, if you get 2 out of 6, or if you get 1 out of 6, depending on the score or the probability, that might be an indication that there is something to be looked at in that particular part of activity that you're reviewing, then tailor your investigation team to that area. So when I set up this team, a lot of my team came from law enforcement. They'd seen this kind of patterns of behavior and this kind of activity occurring. So they kind of knew the key behaviors. I'll talk about some of the key behaviors. So generally, 9 times out of 10, if you're looking at transactional patterns where you've pitched where you want to look, the kind of things you'll see is the use of adult service websites. Okay, you'll see people paying and using adult service websites. You'll see things like third-party payments or the same third-party individual paying into that account or controlling that account. I think Doug mentioned that, or it might have been Angel who mentioned the people using the accounts. It could be things like, you know, pharmacy payments. So it might be that people are going and spending a lot of money at a pharmacy, and it's just it just seems out of the norm for what you might see. And a general thing that you usually see as well in these behavioral patterns is things like takeaways very late at night, or cheap travel, low cost airlines, Airbnbs, taxis, that kind of thing. And all of these things together don't necessarily mean that there is exploitation, but it is an indication that it might be. And I think the beauty of using something like raw data and overlaying it with this information is that when you use transaction monitoring, you kind of have to tell it what to look for every time. Whereas when you're looking at data, it doesn't have to be all of those things that I've talked about. It could be one or two. And I think the key thing when I was training my team to do this work is to look at what are the patterns and what are you seeing? And, are there any surefire indications that this definitely looks like exploitation? On the face of it, you might look at it and think, absolutely not. But generally, if there's one or two or even three of these different behaviors, you will find some kind of exploitation for sure. So I think for me, it was about trying to proactively look for this activity rather than relying on traditional tools. And I think my key piece of advice is, if you've got pieces of information like this and you suspect, do your network analysis. So is this one individual that's paying into this account connected to other accounts and paying into those accounts as well? Because then you've found the criminality. Going back to what Doug says, if there is always money at the end of this, right? This is always for financial gain. This is criminality, and there's always money at the end of it.
I'm going to go to you in a minute, Angel, more to expand more on the embracing of technology and data. But there's a question that came in because you did mention crypto, and I want to read the question and just throw it out to the panel. The question is, for many countries, compensation for fraud or scam prevention exists for banks, but not yet for crypto transfers, which are so rapid. Apart from slowing down crypto transactions or reducing amounts, as Doug suggests, what else can crypto firms do to step in earlier? Perhaps data sharing between firms and public bodies could allow us all to step in earlier to prevent client harm on these scams, or identifying trafficking and exploitation typologies misusing crypto. So your thoughts, Angel, and then we'll go to Doug.
I mean, I think the Mr. McDevitt or Miss McDevitt answered the question, right? I mean, collaboration and data sharing is really so key when we're talking about rapid transfers, right? And so I know that in some fintech spaces, a lot of people are involved in information sharing forums. And there was also a long time ago, John, you're very well familiar with FSISAC, where information technology threats were also being monitored through kind of these groups that were included in, this collaborative intelligence sharing forum. And you're able to get kind of what the real threat was in the moment, right? Like, here's an exchange, here's an IP, here's the name of a company, here's whatever. And you would get that and start to monitor that and have a process in which you would be able to detect, understand what the real threat is, immediate threat is, have a way to detect and stop the transaction from occurring as it hits or right after. But I think collaboration in those forums are invaluable.
What are you seeing, Doug, in that industry? Is there a realization that there should be this sharing of information, or is it too nascent that perhaps that's not the case? Well, because I know you work with firms in that space as well as traditional banks.
Yeah, I haven't done as much on the crypto side as I have in traditional banking. I do think that there is a need for greater information sharing. I think there needs to be guardrails, around that information sharing to protect, to protect the consumer, protect PII, that kind of thing. Um, I I always go back to the fact, though, that when it comes to information sharing, I think we could do a much better job of information sharing between financial institutions, whether it's a traditional bank, um, crypto, whatever. Um, but we need further work in developing cooperation and information sharing between those institutions and law enforcement. And it's a two-way street, right? It's I think law enforcement needs to be more outward focused in building those external engagements, those external partnerships with the financial institutions and providing training, while the financial institutions should also be externally focused and working with law enforcement and building trusted relationships and partnerships, so that when the BSA officer does see something suspicious, they can pick up the phone and they have somebody to call, so that law enforcement can maybe get ahead of the issue rather than just being reactive. Because right now, much of what we're doing is reactive. And by the time we get to it, the money could be gone, whatever. And I think I think we need to formalize better information sharing, and I think we have to stop. Maybe I have to be careful about how I say this, but we have to stop rationalizing why we don't, based on the idea of risk, or we're going to get in trouble if we share information with law enforcement, and we've used that excuse for a long time. We've come up with a lot of excuses why we can't work together, and we haven't focused enough effort on the ways that we can.
Helen, what's it like in the UK and in the EU in terms of financial institutions working collaboratively with law enforcement, whether broad-based information sharing or specific? What's been your experience both at a financial institution, but also with your clients, again, in the EU and UK? What's your takeaway from there?
In the UK, last year and probably the year before, there was a huge project run by law enforcement, the government, called the Data Fusion Project. And what this did is it brought together a number of large financial institutions, like the National Crime Agency in the UK, the regulator, and everybody collaborated on a piece of work that enabled information sharing. So a lot of people were from firms placed into places like the NCA or the regulator to work with these institutions to get all the data together to pull this information sharing pilot together, which is now being expanded into more firms, because I think it was literally probably the big five or the big six financial institutions in the UK. I think it was hugely successful. I've seen a lot of posts on LinkedIn of late of people being commended for the work they've done because of the effort that this went to. And, there was a new law that came in the UK where you can actually share information with other partner financial institutions through what you call it, Section 7. It's not Section 7, I'll come back to you with the number. I can't remember the number now. But
Oh, that's right.
essentially, you can, if you're doing an investigation and you find the information and you know it's connected to another financial institution, you can send them through this law a a piece of information that tells them which customer they need to go and look at and why. Now, they, as a financial institution, you can choose whether you want to do anything with that or not, but you are allowed to now share through this mechanism and share this detail of where you think there is multiple parties involved. You have access to that information. We were my team that I was at last year were part of a couple of those pieces of work that came in. It's the Economic Crime and Transparency Act. There was a big piece of work being done to enable more of that to flow on a more regular and an easier basis. I think the majority of the work that was being done in the background was trying to pull together the data, because everybody's data looks completely different. Everybody gets, everybody gets it from very different places, and it's what's the actual key data elements that you need in order to be able to do this. But from my experience in the UK, this is a huge part of fighting crime together.
Angel, obviously in your role with Polaris, you're very familiar with the information that they've received. They had a hotline. They've had an FIU. They've collected information and shared some of that with financial institutions and also with law enforcement. Talk a bit about some of both the challenges, not from a legal standpoint, I guess, but if the premise, which I agree with, is data becomes, whether it's raw data that Helen referenced or it's more specific, know your customer, onboarding information, whatever it might be, we can't get our arms around these issues without doing a better job with data, right? So talk a bit about what Polaris provides in terms of resources, and then certainly feel free to expand on the issue regarding data in the US and what you see are some of the challenges.
Sure. So, I think if I think back, and I'm going back probably over 20 years now, I've been aware and working with Polaris back even into the kind of Manhattan DA's office days, where I started my financial crimes kind of love, I guess, anti-financial crime, my love affair with anti-financial crime, not financial. But, at that time, there were a lot of efforts to really think about how to leverage what I've started to call collaborative intelligence. So not so much the data, because there are issues, right? Privacy issues with data. Can financial institutions share specific names? Can Polaris as a nonprofit share specific information that they're seeing in the hotline with other people? What can law enforcement share? I mean, I think a lot of those barriers have definitely started to get lower and lower as we learn a lot more about, as we've built relationships across all of the different entities, but also with technology advancement, right? I think there are ways that we can share data or intelligence. I'm going to be careful here, but how we can share intelligence today that can help, right? Financial institutions, law enforcement, leveraging technology and leveraging the learnings from the industry to be able to ultimately monitor, identify, and stop illicit activity from going through financial institutions. So Polaris, as you mentioned, started a financial intelligence unit, and that was really kind of the core of what that unit was to do. They worked with financial institutions, law enforcement. They leveraged various platforms. They leveraged data from their hotline database. They ran the nation's database, the nation's human trafficking hotline for 18 years. Not today, and I'll get into that in a little bit and kind of what they're focused on, because I think that goes very well with what we're talking about here. But they leveraged that data. They looked for patterns. They looked for commonalities, and not necessarily in naming specific people or entities, but industries, right? Hospitality industry, travel industry. Here's what we're seeing in each of these different types of systems. And so they provided those patterns and topologies to financial institutions and law enforcement to basically translate that into what the financial institution might be seeing. So if the Polaris report, which is still out there on their website, says, this is what recruiting looks like as someone goes into a situation where they may be trafficked or forced labor in agriculture. These are, we know that recruiters are coming from, I'm using examples, Mexico, and they're coming through a certain highway, and we're seeing them mostly go through California and to blueberry farms in North Carolina. And we're seeing them an influx coming in April, in the springtime, whatever the case might be, right? There's enough information in there that would allow financial institutions to take that and be able to translate that to the specific raw data information that Helen was talking about to then start to monitor. So that then becomes really the partnership of, hey, here's the intelligence coming from an organization that has data that will inform topologies that financial institutions can leverage to then do their day-to-day monitoring. That's really the wash, rinse, and repeat cycle of collaboration. I think that can really help us work together, as Doug was talking about, right? As with law enforcement and with nonprofits, with technology companies, because there are also technology companies who are interested in wanting to provide tools to facilitate, the eradication of human trafficking worldwide, which I know sounds lofty and big, but I'm convinced more today than I was 10, 15 years ago that we're getting closer to being able to do it. The thing that we're missing is putting all of our heads together in one room in a very focused manner, which is what Polaris is focused on today. And they're calling kind of this movement intelligence to impact, right? How do I leverage all of the things that I've learned, Polaris, the organization, and running the National Human Trafficking Hotline for 18 years, and having national survivor studies that I've run over the years. They're about to revamp another one. The National Survivor Study is going out to, I think the last one had over 500 survivors. They interviewed them with a series of questions and asked them, kind of what their situation was that led them to trafficking and what it looked like. And it's very important for me to note as a board member of the organization that they paid every single one of those survivors for participating in that study. And then they took all of the information that they learned and published a report so that it can help identify what the failures are in the systems that led them to trafficking. But alongside that, if I'm putting on my financial institution hat, there are details that we can glean from that, similar to the information that the FIU was using in order to identify these very specific patterns and topologies that we can then turn into action. So I think, as we think about kind of the future and how we move forward with being able as a industry to have a very focused area that we can really start to make an impact on eradicating human trafficking, it's that collaboration and working with organizations that have the background, the context, the intel, the relationships to be able to call that data and provide the intelligence more holistically to industries such as financial institutions to then leverage that internally.
So, Angel, the survivor study that you mentioned, is it not available yet? Is it out?
There's
What's the status?
there's one that's already published.
Right. Okay.
And alongside that is also being alongside that are all the other resources that I mentioned around there was 20 topologies of human trafficking, right? All stuff that Polaris has previously published, but they're refreshing the National Survivor Study. And then also working through other opportunities and collaborative relationships with other entities in order to leverage the intelligence and the experience to be able to tackle human trafficking, one, from a survivor support perspective, as well as from an intelligence gathering exercise so that they can then share with industries, not just FIs, but with other industries. And I would say for all the investigators and FIs out there, Whatever report is put out, whether or not it's specifically geared towards financial institutions, that's additional information that's going to help you understand what's happening within your FIs much more holistically. And so it's really important to read, the Truckers Alliance report on human trafficking and how often and on what routes, and at what rest stops trucks are stopping for, the 20 minutes that Helen was talking about, right? Like that level of context is really important.
Angel, real quick, somebody just asked this question in terms of resources, and I don't know the answer to this. Are there resources that FIs can access that list certain keywords for trafficking that may be sent between users in, I guess, memo fields and peer-to-peer transactions? What would you recommend, or what do you think?
I would start with the Polaris report. There is a cryptocurrency memo that came out that does list some keywords in it. And maybe we can follow up with the specific name of that report. And I can send that to you, but I don't have it off the top of my head.
That's fine. That's right. We have about 10 minutes left. Doug, I want to go back to you, both your concerns that there's not enough information sharing, but you also have been working closely with Polaris and other organizations, building off of what Angel mentioned in terms of resources. What else would you recommend to our listeners and viewers today regarding how they can get additional valuable information so that they can up their game, if you will, on anti-trafficking financial transactions?
I mean, I think first of all, it all starts with being educated with the basic facts, learning what it is, to begin with. And Angel had a really good point about data and intelligence, and really intelligence is verified data that helps organizations make operational decisions. That's really the difference between data and intelligence. And there are a lot of resources out there, whether it's through Polaris. The Noble has a number of resources that are available. As a matter of fact, we've worked very closely with them on keyword indexes surrounding major sporting events, and other big events around the country to help target human trafficking and other forms of exploitative crime. But I think sometimes it's just we miss the forest on account of the trees. Maybe like if you begin seeing a lot of transactions that are happening, between the hours of 12 and 2, and then maybe 5 and 10 p.m., doesn't necessarily mean it's trafficking, but it's an indicator, because we know that a lot of people purchase sex between 12 and 2 in the afternoon and after 5 p.m., from about 5 p.m. till 10 p.m. And, just transactions or money transfers, things like that, that might be disguised as legitimate business, but they don't necessarily make sense for the type of business that's operating that account. Those types of things. So I think it's really just a matter of getting ourselves educated, looking at there are a ton of resources that are out there, again, through the Noble, through Polaris, through the DHS Blue campaign, that you can that you can review, and look for these things, and just whether you develop cheat sheets or you commit these things to memory. I think that's really where we need to start. We need to really just start kind of with the basics.
Helen, let me ask you this as someone, again, with the experience you've had on all sides there. Give us some of your key takeaways. You've talked about hiding in plain sight. You've talked about data, raw data, and other issues. Obviously, the training becomes essential. Give the audience some takeaways beyond this. And obviously, Doug's made the point about resources. And when this recording goes out to everybody in the next week or so, we'll put in the show notes, as they say, links to all the things here that you folks have mentioned, because there is as Doug says, there's a ton of resources out there that are valuable. But Helen, what are some of the key points you want to make sure the audience leaves today with?
I think for me, I would echo what Doug just said about education. Knowledge is key. If you're going to try and proactively find this stuff and be able to do something about it, you need to know what you're looking at and what it looks like. And that could be through education, through training, through transactional analysis, whichever way. But the only way that you're going to be a success at trying to find this kind of activity is if you know what you're looking for and that you understand what you're seeing. And those typical patterns, like Doug just mentioned about the timings, the timestamp on transactions is absolutely critical. Piecing together a network, a pattern, a behavior, whatever it might be, is the only way you really can catch this kind of activity, because it's not your traditional method as what you would normally see in traditional kind of money laundering or fraud. So I think for me, yeah, education, data, understanding, analytics, network analysis.
Yeah, and
Angel,
I would add,
yeah, go ahead, Doug.
I
Sorry.
would,
Go.
yeah, I would add to that the media, through just misrepresentation of what human trafficking is, it has conditioned us to look for all the wrong things. And if we spend all of our time looking for the wrong things, we're never going to see the things that we actually need to see. And just, anecdotally, like, to me, like, one of the biggest indicators for human trafficking, or in particular sex trafficking, as it relates to the hospitality industry in particular, are people who will, those transactions where a person reserves a hotel room using a credit card. And then when they show up at the hotel, they say, well, I don't want to pay for it on the credit card. I want to give you cash. They think that there's no record of that because nothing's actually been charged to the card. They don't realize that the card's been authorized and that kind of thing. There's a record. To me, that is one of the most telltale signs of trafficking there is, but we tend to overlook it. I mean, it's so simple, it's so basic. But that's just an example of, if you don't know what you're looking for, or if you're looking for people chartering private jets, or whatever the case might be late at night, you're going to miss those seemingly innocuous things that are real intelligence.
Oh, that makes sense. Angel, final thoughts.
Three things, and I'm going to zoom out here for a second because some people out there might be thinking, I would love to do all of this stuff, but I work in a financial institution and we don't have enough people, resources, funding, etc. Use the governance structures in place today that you already must do, i.e. reporting to the board, reporting to management, using your airtime with senior executives to demonstrate the value and the importance of detecting and identifying this type of activity is. So all of the work that you're doing, do case studies, import the indicators of human trafficking and do a risk assessment and include it in your risk assessment. And speaking as a former, CCO and AMLO, I want to look for that in my risk assessment so I can tell my board and my executive leadership team, these are our risks for human trafficking specifically. And by the way, right, it's a concentration area for FinCEN. And so it's really important to ensure that your senior leadership is aware of that. 2, stop the cycle and become aware of how we can support from a financial institution perspective, survivor support and inclusion. One of the biggest problems that survivors have when they get out is the ability to open up bank accounts, the ability to find their own financial stability. So there are several projects out there that many financial institutions are a part of to help survivor inclusion from a financial perspective. Really, really important. 3, support, volunteer, spread the word, go out and tell one person something new you've learned today to help those wheels spin and get people's juices flowing on how we can collaborate better.
Angel, Helen, Doug, thank you so much for your insight today. As I mentioned, we'll obviously put together the resources that you've identified plus others. Let's hope by next January we don't have to continue to have Human Trafficking Awareness Month, but obviously it's something that's been going on for such a long period of time. What I think the positives are is that the financial sector has definitely stepped up their game in the past decade. I don't think there's any question. And as Angel knows, because she was involved with a project that I was with her on years ago when many folks at financial institutions told their senior leaders, we just need to do more. And I think that's really happening. Then we've had actual experts like Doug who are in the public sector and work closely with the financial sector. And then what Helen has pointed out, what's going on in the UK and the EU. So there's optimism that there's concerted efforts, but obviously more continues to need to be done. Thanks everybody for the time today. This is it for AML Voices for January. Next month, we'll be diving into suspicious activity reporting and some of the challenges there. That information will be posted on our website. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. Talk to you soon.